Hello, friends, colleagues, neighbors. Welcome to another Lunch and Learn with GEO. We're going to cover a very interesting topic, remote notarization. Something completely different, something that old guys like me don't know anything about. So we're going to learn something new today. We are recording. So here is the obligatory disclaimer from the Bar Association warning you that we are recording. If you have any questions, please use the chat box. I haven't muted anybody, but if you're not going to talk, please mute yourself. We don't want to hear everybody coughing and sneezing. If you want to post to social media, use our hashtag Lunch and Learn with GEO. I want to remind you that on June 22nd, video depositions at trial, how to use them. Lexitas, which is a regular sponsor of our events, and Sean Driscoll, whose father was the president of the NWSBA many, many years ago, after me though. We're going to give you instructions on getting CLE credit after the program. Today, we are joined by Christine Sparks and Dawn Efflandt from ATG. So welcome them. And I am going to remind you that we are here because of our ethical obligations to stay familiar with the obligations and to learn the benefits and risks associated with technology. And so I try to keep technology in our discussions. And this is a national issue about lawyers keeping abreast of changes in the law and the benefits of technology. So with that, I am going to turn this over to our speakers. I'm going to stop sharing. And Dawn, it's up to you now.
Okay, Dawn's going to share the PowerPoint for us. So thank you for the introduction. So we are with ATG. I've been with ATG 18 years, and Dawn started with us really right before the pandemic. So she started at a really interesting time to kind of pivot all of title operations for us. And she focuses on the Chicago metro area and our centralized services. So what we're going to be discussing today is remote online notarization. We have a couple of things that we're obviously real estate focused. You can go to the next slide, Dawn. We're obviously real estate focused, but this does have applications outside of the title industry and real estate as well. And we're going to try and touch on that to the extent that we have broader knowledge for that, because it's going to apply to other practices areas as well. The first thing that we wanted to talk about, even though we're talking about remote online notarization, is that Illinois is authorizing as well remote ink notarization. That's different than a lot of the states. We did have RIN that came into effect with executive order during COVID. And we were really at the process where legislation had been introduced for a couple of sessions before COVID to try and legalize remote online notarization. Since we didn't have it in place at the time, we got the executive order with remote ink notarization being put into place. And there was a lot of interest from mainly the estate bar, honestly, to also have RIN still be authorized once we got remote online notarization. So I'm going to go through just a high level of what RIN is, so you're familiar with that, because I think you're going to see that especially outside of real estate. Dawn's going to cover at the end more information about the vendors and the lender requirements for it, which really dictates from a title standpoint whether or not we can use particular vendors. So the RIN is not usually a great solution in real estate transactions unless it's a cash deal, because a lot of the lenders will not approve it. But RIN does come into play in areas where you're not having to get third-party approval for it, where the lender doesn't control it. So just briefly with RIN, RIN is different than RON because RON is completely electronically notarizing it. RIN has where you're going to have the signer and the notary in different locations. They have to both be physically located in Illinois for RIN to be used. You have to video record it. So you're generally what would happen is, like, we'll use a real estate transaction as an example. You'll have the lender package will get physically sent or printed to the buyer. If there's a loan transaction with it, they will then print it out. There will be a video conference between both the notary and the person who's signing the documents, and that has to be recorded after you authenticate who the person is. The person who is signing the documents will sign it on this two-way electronic video conference that's taking place. They'll sign the physical documents, and then after they've signed them, they get returned to the notary, who will then wet ink notarize those documents as well. The notary signs it as of the date of the recording. So when they saw the person actually sign it, so typically it's not going to get back to the notary until a day or two later if you're overnighting it or however it's getting back to them. But the date on the notary will be the date of the recording. And we actually have wet signatures for everything. And like I said, it was first authorized by executive order. There was a lot of discussion since we were in the middle of the legislation regarding RON during COVID, and it was decided to codify RIN as well. And the limitations are really because of the lender requirements in the real estate market, because the lenders aren't going to authorize it when they're not comfortable with it. They're worried about challenges to it if something goes wrong with the mortgage. Next one, Dawn. Thanks. So here's the requirements for RIN. The signatory and the notary have to be in Illinois. Signatory has to provide their address, and then there has to be a two-way video conference that is taking place. The recording has to be preserved for 3 years, and each page actually physically has to be shown on the video recording. So you would be holding it up, your document up like this, and then they have to be signed, and they have to, each page needs to be shown on that video recording. And then you have to paper out, obviously, so that the actual signature doc that was signed by whoever it is that's a signatory then gets sent, and then the notary signs it once they receive the documents. So that's RIN generally. Like I said, it was really the estate bar. We'll talk about with the vendors in a little bit, but the main reason is because the RON providers, which we'll get into more, have charges. You have to use specific platforms for that. And there was a belief in the bar in general that you were going to have to pay too much for the vendor to use it, and people wanted to have other options rather than being tied to vendors. Like I said, in the real estate world, if there's a lender, the lender's controlling all of that, but RIN is a good option probably in other practice areas besides real estate. So here's the summary of remote online notarization. You can have the signer and notary being in different locations, and the documents are actually signed electronically. So unlike RIN, where they're printing the documents, they're signing the physical documents and shipping them back. This is all happening electronically, and the notary has an electronic seal. So what I'm going to go through, you can go to the next one, thanks. We're going to touch on a couple of aspects for RON. So typically what happens is you have legislation that authorizes RON in a state, and then there's the second part of it, which is the Secretary of State promulgates rules for how the RON is going to be administered in the state. So we're going to touch on both of those. But before I get to those, I'm going to go through a little bit of the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac RIN and RON guidelines, because in the world of real estate and lenders, that's who's going to dictate what has to be utilized. So you're going to have to follow state law, but if you're not going to follow the Fannie and Freddie guidelines, it's generally not going to be sold on the secondary market, and we run into issues with that. So Fannie and Freddie require for both RIN and RON that state law be followed. So you have to follow whatever the state law is for where the property is, and there cannot be any exceptions on a title insurance policy related to the fact that the documents were signed by either RIN or RON. It has to be acceptable to the recorder. in whatever county the property is getting recorded, or whatever county the property is located in. And then the recording has to be kept for 10 years. There is a requirement regarding how you identify and verify the authentication of the person who is signing the documents. So they require two-factor authentication, and Fannie and Freddie specifically require that government issued photo ID that has a signature is used, and credential analysis and identity proofing. So their requirements are a little bit usually above what legislation requires, and typically follows what you're going to see in the Secretary of State rules for the jurisdictions. And there also is a requirement that the security regarding whatever system you're using. So if you're using one of the vendor platforms for it, or your own, or Microsoft Teams, or any of things along those lines, is that there has to be system security, that Fannie and Freddie has specific guidelines on what that security is to make sure that the identity of the person and any of the non-public personal information isn't at risk. And that has to be stored for 2 years. There's also a requirement for a notarial journal, keeping track of what was signed by it, and a requirement that what technology was used is also recorded in there so that we have it, so that they know if an issue comes up, which technology was used.
I have a quick questions, Christine. Do the video, is that has to be saved in a particular format? Or is it saved in a library of some sort?
It has to be saved in a format that is secure. So there's not, some of the vendors that do RON have specific requirements, and they save the document for you, which is generally what I'm going to say people should be looking for. You don't really want people storing it on their individual computers. When we were doing RIN, we were storing some of that documentation that obviously can take up a lot of space, but we, as a title company, had a lot of security built around that. So there's just a requirement that it be kept secure, but not what is used to secure it. Ready for me to go on? You got more? No? Okay. So now I'm going to touch on the legislation that was passed during COVID. So this is the citation for it. And it covers a couple of areas. There are both notaries and electronic notaries. You can be both, but you have to apply for both. So just because you're a notary and electronic notarization got approved in Illinois does not mean that all the notaries are now approved to be electronic notaries. That has to be applied for separately. You have to register with the Secretary of State to be an electronic notary, not with the individual county. And there's an additional bond that is required. There's a bond to be a notary, but then the bond for an electronic notary is an additional one. There are electronic seals that have to be used if you're using any of the RON platforms that get issued. And there's also the requirement in the Illinois law, similar to the Fannie and Freddie requirements, that there be a notarial journal kept regarding what notarizations are being taken place. So when we're looking at the legislation, the vendor approval part is that vendors have to approve or have to send their electronic platform to the Secretary of State to get approved. So typically what this looks like in various states, like Wisconsin, for example, right before COVID had passed their RON legislation, but they hadn't done their Secretary of State rules yet. So they got emergency rules in there. And they approved in Wisconsin specific vendors. I think it was 3 notary vendors, that electronic notary vendors that they had approved. This is not specifically saying which vendors it's going to be authorizing, but they do have to go through an approval process with the Secretary of State. Parties don't have to be in Illinois when documents are being notarized. The individuals can be outside of the state of Illinois, anywhere in the United States. They can also be outside of the United States in specific situations. It's if it involves property that's located in the United States, or it's for some sort of governmental filing. So there are exceptions to they have to be in the United States, but no longer a requirement that you have to be in Illinois. The legislation went into effect January 1st, 2022, or when the Secretary of State promulgated rules. We have draft rules that have been promulgated by the Secretary of State that are currently going through the whole JCAR process. And so we're waiting on those getting approved, but we have seen draft ones of those. And I'm going to cover the draft ones. I think we'll probably see some changes, but not significant changes to what was produced by the Secretary of State's office. So here, the standards for remote vendor approval, we'll go through that a little bit. And then the main areas of the Secretary of State's rules fall into three categories. So the remote vendor approvals, how you have to authenticate the signatory's identity, and then the privacy and storage standards. So the Secretary of State, like I said, has notary and electronic notaries. There is a lot of information in the Secretary of State's rules covering the type of course that has to be taken by the notary seeking to be an electronic notary and the exam. And it's very specific. There has to be this many of questions in each time frame of the training that the course has for the electronic notary. So it is definitely a step up from the requirements to be a non-electronic notary that's requiring. It's a 3-hour course that's being proposed that would have to be taken, and an exam of 50 questions that people would have to answer. Looking at, you have to designate when you're applying what vendor you're going to use. We anticipate that you're going to have notaries, especially in the real estate, notaries that are working in the real estate field are going to have multiple vendors listed because the vendor is typically chosen by the buyer's lender and you don't have control over that. So we expect that we'll see the main vendors are going to be applied for by all of them. I had mentioned that the notary bond is different for electronic. So a non-electronic notary, the bond is $5,000 as opposed to a $25,000 bond that's required if you're going to be designated as an electronic notary. So the standards that the Secretary of State has, obviously they're concerned with the accuracy and the reliability of the record. So there has to be reliable audio-visual communication between the two parties. It has to be that they're confirming the identity of the buyer and or the signer. Similarly to with a regular non-electronic notary, there can be personal knowledge or remote presentation of a person of their government ID. And we'll go through a little bit, I think Don will probably briefly touch on, but the different vendors have specific ways where you have to show it up, you have to hold it, you have to turn it, you have to answer knowledge-based authentication questions, like similar to if you're calling a lender for yourself, you're calling your bank and you have to confirm your identity and they ask you those questions, like which of these cars did you own? Did you live at, which of these addresses did you live at? That type of questions can be used for that. You can go to the next one. Thanks. Vendor requirements. Like I said, the Secretary of State is going to have to certify providers. Their rules are setting out what they're going to require providers to submit to them in order to approve them. Dawn's going to touch on the vendors a bit more, but that's generally what the law is. We expect the Secretary of State rules to mostly get approved the way that they are right now and not a whole lot of changes to that, but we'll see as time goes on if there's going to be changes to that. There's some feedback from different people within the industry that are submitting comments to the Secretary of State. So we do anticipate some small tweaks, but not significant changes. They're generally following standards that will be approved by lenders, Fannie and Freddie, and then Dawn will go into some of the other standards. Dawn, I'll turn it over to you.
Anybody have questions on anything Christine went over before I start talking about some of the vendors and the, how they're being determined, what kinds of things you're going to be looking for when you're talking to vendors, things like that?
The vendor is providing what?
In a lot of the cases now that we're looking at vendors, unlike us just getting into a Zoom session today and the RIN situation that Christine was talking about, when you're using a vendor to provide the remote online notarization, they're then going to take the responsibility for storing the videos, providing the technology platform that you're going to be communicating under. That they'll be determining what technology is used to actually share the electronic documents and then store those, particularly in the real estate space.
The only way we're going to be able to do electronic notarization is to use a vendor. Is that the only way we could do it?
You could create your own platform, but then you would have to submit it to the Secretary of State and get it approved. And you'd have to show them that you have the appropriate security requirements, the appropriate identity, authorization technology, and all of those things. So I think in most cases, people who are doing this in a case-by-case basis are going to end up using a vendor who's going to go through all that vetting process first.
And what do the vendors typically charge?
It can be a pretty substantial range. We're finding that the average runs right around $100 to do a notary session with most of these vendors. Some of them will have additional charges based on the number of documents that you're having signed. Others will just charge you a session fee, and you can have as many documents as needed notarized. If you've ever used a DocuSign, you can load documents in, you identify the areas where the document's going to be executed, and then those are kind of checked off as you go. That's called flagging. And some platforms will do that flagging for you, and others will require that you do it as part of your upload and your obligation as a user of the platform. So that's some of the things that people are going to want to consider. And we'll talk about as we go through, what using these vendors will look like. We've started using some of them in the real estate space once RON was approved under the emergency orders, because lenders have started using them too. And they tend to be the biggest proponents right now of the software, because now they can access their buyers anywhere in the country, and sometimes out of country if that's what's needed. If any of you have been in a real estate transaction and your buyer's on vacation, or your seller has gone off to Europe for the summer and you need to get those documents signed, it creates a real challenge when people have to go to an embassy or get to the consulate or find a notary in another country or another state if those documents weren't previously accepted for recording in Illinois, or it slowed the process down to send out physical documents, get them executed somewhere, and get them back in time for your transaction.
Does ATG have a recommended vendor?
We have currently been using Notarize, but I would say as long as the vendor is meeting the state requirements that they're really, and your lender's requirements, if it is a buy, sell, or lender type transaction, we don't necessarily have a recommendation.
And if you're not going to use a vendor, RIN is really what you're generally probably going to use. If you're going to do RON, you're probably going to use a vendor. So if you don't want to use a vendor, RIN is the option.
I saw the FedEx thing over there waiting for the red light.
What FedEx?
I don't know.
UPS or FedEx?
Any other questions before I go on? Okay. So as Christine mentioned, because we're in the real estate space, lenders are really dictating a lot of the vendor decisioning that we're going to be doing, because they have not only to worry about the notary requirement for the documents, but they also have to look at how an electronic document can be stored and transferred securely. Because if they're going to have this transaction done electronically for a mortgage, for example, they need to be able to have an electronic note that's going to be stored. There's things called e-vaults that will store some of these documents and then transfer them from one entity to another if they're selling these loans on a secondary market. So what we've seen so far is that most vendors will not only conform to the state requirements in the areas that they're working, but they're also going to be looking at what the mortgage industry standards are. And MISMO, which is the Mortgage Industry Standards Maintenance Organization, and ALTA, the American Land Title Association, have been pretty heavily involved in determining what the requirements should be for these vendors, how they're going to collaborate with the people that are using their platforms, how the information will be stored, and then what that exchange of information is going to look like, and standardizing some of the language that we use. Because when we all first started talking about this, we'd say RIN, RON, people weren't really sure what exactly fell in each of those categories. And so this is really helping us standardize that when we say RIN or RON or e-note or e-vault, everybody is talking about the same thing, which can be pretty confusing otherwise. They, as we mentioned, are really going to matter because they are outlining which platforms these lenders are going to be able to use. They've reviewed all the Fannie and Freddie requirements so that they can make sure that a vendor who has been authorized by their platform, which they launched in 2020, is going to meet the standards that you're going to need for not only the state, but for the industry. It also keeps people from having to do these assessments on their own. You can imagine as an individual practitioner trying to vet all of these different vendor platforms and determine which one is going to be the best for your use case and who's going to provide the range of services that you might need could be pretty cumbersome. So this is a nice thing to have an area where you can go and see a list of companies that have already gone through these processes and verified that they're meeting the standard in order for you to choose which ones you might want to use. So we'll be sharing, I'm sure, the slideshow presentation, and you can visit MISMO.org, where they have a list of all of the best practices that they're requiring these vendors conform to. Like Christine mentioned, what they do for credential analysis and authentication. So how are they verifying people's identities? If you've ever done those kinds of questionnaires where they ask you, either 3 security questions that you've previously provided, or you have to give some sort of information that would be relevant only to you. We find sometimes those can be a little challenging when you get into some of these technology platforms because they rely not only on your answers, but sometimes what IP address are you logging in from? There's a lot of metadata, as the IT people call it out there, that goes into some of this authentication. And it can be pretty confusing for an individual to try to figure out what's going to work. Storing those records, as we talked about, as technologies change, we're still going to have to be able to access this information. So knowing that there's a platform that's going to keep that information, store the records, and has appropriate security to be able to maintain that. Most of these companies show SOC certifications and all of those other things in order to guarantee that they're going to be able to hold that data securely. Depending on what you're having executed, there could be a lot of non-public personal information in there that we have an obligation to protect. MISMO does not necessarily verify that they're meeting state-specific requirements, but the lenders that use them aren't going to allow for it without that. So it really becomes a dual process in that case. They're considering platforms that have been approved by the states already, and then there may be an additional higher standard that that lender is going to require. So far, there are about 22 vendors that have been certified through MISMO, and it does continue to grow because this is becoming a pretty important space in particular the mortgage and real estate industries. But as you can imagine, there are a lot of other applications for being able to do remote online notarization, and people are going to want to see those for estate law, other areas where anytime you have to get something notarized and you can't be in physical proximity to that person, this is going to be a new solution for people. When looking at a provider, depending on what your use case is, may determine which vendors are going to be right for you. Cost, of course, is going to become an important factor, but I would suggest that you demo a couple of programs. Every one of these vendor platforms will do a demo with you where you ask for a demo. Within 15 or 20 minutes, they can run through, what kind of devices can I do this on? What kind of browsers can I use to do this? Like we mentioned before, how are the documents going to get into the system for the customer to execute? And who is going to be responsible for identifying where they're supposed to be executed? How many people can you have in the transaction room? And that's been a big impact for the mortgage industry. When these things first came out, it was typically just the notary and the signer who were involved in the notary session itself online in that two-way audio video. But what we've found is that very often that customer still has questions about those documents and they want their legal representation involved, or they want their loan officer to be able to explain information that's on those documents during that session, instead of having to do a lot of advanced work explaining everything that your customer is going to see before they join that session with the notary. And then they're stuck if they're kind of mid-signing and they are not really sure what to do. So having a platform that allows multiple parties to attend as long as they've been invited is going to be important. And then, as Christine mentioned before, also making sure you can't have uninvited parties joining the transaction. So it is a secure audio video session. Some of these platforms will provide the seal for the notary and others won't. So if you're a notary and you're going to be using one of these platforms, that's going to be an important question to ask. Do you have to obtain and store your own digital signature, or will the platform just create one for you when you register with them? And you may register with multiple platforms depending on what services they offer and how those relate to the notary needs that you're going to have. And then what does the signer experience look like? We are very aware that the technology comfort level of customers is pretty vastly ranging, right? Some people are not sure how to even log into an audio video session, let alone, what are they going to do? What is this going to look like? And finding something that's going to be relatively easy for a customer to follow along. Maybe they get an email invitation, they click a link, and then somebody's there to walk them through that and help them if they aren't sure how to access that technology. The support is going to be a big piece that you want to consider when looking at a vendor, because you may not always have the expertise to walk someone through how they're, if they're having trouble completing that knowledge-based authentication, or if they can't get their video to work or things like that. It seems silly, but it's a big challenge that some people have. And even just, do they have the technology that they need to be able to participate in a session like this? You want to know how long it takes. Is this something where somebody can pop in and they're going to be on demand and they can get their document signed in 10 or 15 minutes? Or other platforms, it's a first come, first serve basis. You get the link, you log in, and you kind of wait in a waiting room until the next notary is available to sign with you. And what is that waiting period if something like that is the case? And then what is the cost? Is it a monthly platform fee? If you do a lot of this kind of work, that might be something that would interest you. Is it a per session notary fee? And are you going to pass that along to the customer, or is that something that you or your company are going to absorb when you're offering these notaries to people and this is a solution? And then for people like in different industries that also are working with other third parties, vendors, title companies, lenders, can you integrate some of these things with your services? If you have a client relationship management tool that you use, like a smoke ball is popular in real estate industry, can you have some of that information communicated back and forth between your software and this vendor's software? And that, particularly for people like us at ATG and having production systems that we work with, being able to push and pull data back and forth between ourselves and these vendors becomes really important, and it can be a big time saver. And then, like we discussed, what is the training and the tech support and the solutions going to be when people have questions when they're looking at these things? So there are a lot of resources out there. Alta and MISMO just recently did do a seminar that went over what these platforms go through to get approved, who some of them are, because we're starting to see more and more come into the space. And then also, what kind of things should you be looking for? So we shared those resources as well, in case that's something that you'd want to look at. But ultimately, it's kind of a trial and error when it comes to some of these vendors. We've found that some are extremely responsive, others are not. And there are going to be a lot of questions about how that session looks when you do a notary. But it's been a really great solution for a lot of people. Like we mentioned, having the ability to notarize for someone who's in another state than your notary is, having the ability to do some of these things electronically. And we're seeing that more and more customers are demanding that they have the ability, either because they like the use of technology or because they're in a position where they don't have the option. COVID was a really big driver of a lot of this because people couldn't physically come together with a notary. If you were COVID positive, people aren't going to want to sit in a room with you to be able to witness and execute your documents. And being able to do a lot of it online is going to become a solution that's really helpful for solving for circumstances like that. Any questions about how that looks? I think I may have gone through a little faster than I could have.
Well, I'm sure there's some questions out there. Does anybody have any questions so far? Everybody's got this figured out?
How many people have used DocuSign for something in the past to get documents executed? Okay. So the signing portion of it is going to be really pretty similar. You know, that experience that you see where you get an email invitation to look at your documents, they all appear on screen while you're doing the signing. You're kind of clicking the spaces where you're executing either initials or signatures. What this allows you to do is add that notary component to the document as well. We have seen some counties who were a little resistant to accepting these, but most of them are recognizing now that because they're getting the pressure from the mortgage industry, particularly in order to receive these, because if it's a legal solution for getting the documents notarized, the counties are going to kind of come along. We do still have a few counties out there who are not even electronically recording. And in those cases, what you'll find is that they will paper out, like Christine mentioned, in the RIN solution, where you're still actually getting a physical wet sign executed document. In the cases where you have a county that doesn't accept an electronic recording, they'll paper out a certified copy of this electronically notarized document, and that can be recorded in your local recorder's office. So if you're in an area that you don't have e-recording as a solution, you can still paper out and record in those areas if it's a document that'll need that.
And we think that as once the Secretary of State rules are finalized, we'll probably see all the other counties come on. They just don't want to have standards set for what they're going to accept. So once those are set, we'll probably see more movement in that place, because there is, like Don said, for the real estate segment, this is all lender driven. The lenders want remote notaries for their transactions. They don't want to do the physical closings. We'll see. I think we're going to still have physical closings for a long time, but with COVID, speaking for ATG, the number of attorneys who are coming to the closing physically has decreased substantially, even as things have opened up a lot more. And I'm not sure that we're going to see that shift. So the arguments against remote online notarization, when you don't have the attorneys physically present sitting in a closing room, I think you're going to start to see a bigger shift towards adoption of RON with that. And our goal at ATG has been to make sure, are we designing how we handle the process to make sure that the attorneys are still involved, even though they're not physically present at a closing room with everybody, but that the virtual closing room where documents are being signed, they're part of it.
Wow, quite a change. It's a seismic change in how we deal with it.
It is.
It is.
Does anybody have any questions? Dawn, you want to stop sharing?
Sure.
All right, and then we come to a very important part of the presentation. If you want credit, this is what you have to do. Send an email to the NWSBA, actually to attendance@nwsba.org. On the subject line, say, thank you, NWSBA, because this is free. And then include your full name and your ARDC number. And that's how you get credit. And then next time, June 22nd, using video depositions at trial. And also, June 23rd is our installation dinner. So with that, with no more questions, I'm going to stop sharing. Yeah, I did stop sharing. Cool. All right. And I'm going to stop recording.